Hello and welcome. Moss Adams is pleased that you joined us for today's session, Grant Compliance Essentials for Effective Management. Before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. Our webcasts are designed to help elevate your business performance. Transform your future for the better with advisory solutions tailored to your vision and supported by our collective technical resources. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% or 3 of the 4 polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. Polling questions will appear within the slide window. To participate in the polls, please click on your answer and be sure to hit the Submit button to record your response. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry, if you can't download your CPE certificate today, we'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet to receive credit. The attendance sheet is available in our slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit only can be awarded to participants registered as themselves, and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
Before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge our big news that Moss Adams and Baker Tilly are joining forces to create a new firm, one designed to serve the needs of the middle market. It's really exciting, and you can read more about it on our website from the link in the console. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenters: Sheila Herrera, Principal, Halie Garcia, Principal, and Dani Springfels, Senior Manager here at Moss Adams, now Baker Tilly. Their bios and contact information are located in your console if you would like more information. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Sheila to get the presentation started. Sheila.
Thanks, Danielle. Hope everyone's having a good day. I'm going to go ahead and get started with some basic grant information, as I'm sure we have several individuals on the call here that may be dealing with their first grant. Ultimately, grants provide funding to help organizations achieve goals that align with the grantor's mission. They often support activities like research, community programs, education, and infrastructure. Most of the grants we see are awarded to non-for-profit organizations, educational institutions, government entities, but we have, continue to see more and more grants awarded to certain businesses for things like research or infrastructure, depending on kind of the government's appetite to award funds right now. So unlike loans, grants do not require any kind of repayment back. And so jumping over to the next slide here are some types of grants that we typically see. Formula grants are funds distributed to recipients based on a predetermined formula set by the grantor. This formula often, considers factors such as population size, poverty rates, and other demographic data. Because the allocation is formula driven, these grants are typically non-competitive. Recipients can usually expect funding amounts based on the formula each funding cycle. So every year they're looking at this formula. And then formula grants are common in federal and state programs aiming at supporting ongoing services or infrastructure. So we typically see a lot of these, for examples, in schools and how that's done. Project grants are awarded competitively and are intended to fund specific projects or activities with defined objectives and timelines. Applicants must submit proposals detailing their project plans, any budgets, and expected outcomes. The grantor, then evaluates these proposals and selects recipients based on merit, alignment with funding priorities, and feasibility. Project grants usually have a fixed period of performance and require detailed reporting on progress and results. And then you have block grants, which provide recipients with a lump sum of money to support broad programs or services within a general area, such as health, education, community development. Unlike project grants, block grants offer more flexibility in how funds are used, allowing recipients to allocate resources according to local needs and priorities. These grants typically aim to streamline funding and reduce administrative burdens by consolidating multiple funds streams into multiple funding streams into one. And then the last category here is categorical grants. These are provided for a specific category or purpose, often with strict guidelines on how the money can be spent. These grants are typically more restrictive than block grants and typically targeted toward narrowly defined programs or activities. Recipients must comply with detailed requirements and reporting to ensure funds are used as intended. Categorical grants are common in areas like education, transportation, and social service. Understanding the type of grant that you have is important because it does affect eligibility, application requirements, and overall reporting when you're looking at that at the end of the day. And so some of the common sources of grants where we see funding coming from, the federal agencies push out a ton of grants each year. Those typically come with very stringent compliance and often audit requirements. And so I think people are often hesitant to apply for federal funding or get federal funding. But once you have everything set up, it's a mechanism to kind of follow those items. And Halie will talk more through that a little bit later. But other grantors on here may have less stringent requirements, but may want you to provide some reporting back to them showing that you are using the funds for the purpose that they're intended for. And then just some grant management basics. Usually effective grant management involves several key components. First, budget management is critical. This means carefully tracking expenses to ensure all costs align with the approved budget. Maintaining thorough documentation is essential. This includes keeping detailed records of expenditures, contracts, grants, any communications related to the grant from the grantor. Sometimes you get items in emails that are not part of the grant award. And so some of that becomes very important to keep documentation-wise. And then timely and accurate reporting is also important. Organizations must submit required progress and financial reports by their deadlines. And then lastly, strict compliance with all the grant terms, conditions, applicable laws, necessary to avoid any kind of penalties and maintain good standing with funders. So Danielle, I'll kick it off to you to kind of start our first polling question.
Thank you, Sheila. What is the biggest challenge your organization faces when managing grants? A, finding and applying for suitable grants. B, meeting complex compliance and reporting requirements. C, managing grant budgets and allowable costs. D, coordinating multiple grants simultaneously. E, finding experienced team members to manage grants. The polling questions are located right on the slides we are presenting. If you can't see it, you may need to hit the F5 key to refresh your console. To respond, please click the button next to your answer you choose and make sure to hit that submit button so that we can record your responses. And we'll go ahead and keep this poll open for about the next 10 seconds. and the results. Sheila, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Danielle. Yeah, it looks like a mixed bag of answers, but mostly meeting complex compliance requirements and reporting requirements. Those always tend to be the hesitation as people get into federal grant funding or any type of grant funding. And we see that quite a bit. So some of the most common challenges that we often see as we talk to our clients are around these complex application requirements. Often, unless you have a grant writer on your team or someone that may be familiar with this process, it's often difficult to make sure that you have submitted the correct information as part of the application process, which if it's not correct, they may have times where they go back and forth with you, which delays the process in getting grant funding. Many grant funds come with strict reporting deadlines. Some of these reports are often financial reports, but a lot of these grants also have special reports discussing either the program service or the project. And so the grantor is wanting more information on how that grant funding is being used and the progression of how it's being used. And then if you have multiple grants, often the challenge becomes how do you manage those grants as they have different start dates, they may have different compliance requirements, different costs that relate to those grants. How are you accounting for that cost? What costs are being allocated to which grant? And are you tracking costs for things like unallowable costs? Are you tracking your direct costs appropriately? And so you can really see how that starts to add up quickly. And then do you have that kind of proper general ledger system on your side set up to ensure that you properly can track costs? And so if you don't set up for success, it is difficult to kind of catch up at the end when you're trying to do things like audits and that type of thing. And then finally, ensuring compliance with regulations. They're constantly changing all the time. And so the government does not make it easy for us to have to follow any grant compliance regulations when they're changing or they're updating items within the CFR from year to year. And so just keeping up with all those things sometimes becomes very difficult. And so grant compliance means following all the rules, regulations, and requirements established by the grantor. This process is essential to making sure that the funds provided are used properly and strictly for the purposes outlined in the grant agreement. Here on the next slide, talking about why grant compliance is important. It ensures the proper use of either public or private funds. A lot of times these are tax dollars getting reawarded in a grant, funding mechanism. And so we want to make sure that those dollars are being used appropriately. It shows accountability and transparency to the grantor. If you're following compliance, there's less risk of having audit findings or any potential legal issues down the road. If you're following the grant compliance, it builds trust with your funders and stakeholders, and ultimately they want to award future contracts and ensure a successful grant closeout. And so here are some of the key areas of grant compliance. I won't go through a lot of these in detail, but we wanted to highlight some of the key items here for financial management, tracking of expenditures. You have your programmatic compliance, your goals that you set out to deliver in the grants. There's various compliance that may come with your grant, and not all of them may be applicable, but some of them would and will be. And so understanding what those look like, that record keeping that I was talking about. Some do have instances where you may have to go out and subcontract. And so you would have to have, policies around procurement and making sure that you're following the policy, the CFR related to procurement and those roles. And then personnel and timekeeping. How are you tracking how your staff are being charged to each of the grants becomes very important down the road. And so some of the best practices that we've identified for ensuring grant compliance, it's important to develop and maintain compliance checklists for each grant. This helps track all requirements and deadlines in one place. Training staff on the specific grant requirements and organizational policies is essential so everyone understands their responsibilities. Establishing strong internal controls and approval process helps prevent errors and unauthorized activities. Regular reviews and audits of grant activities allow you to identify and address any issues early so that you don't have to work through that after you've already started the audit process. Maintaining open communication with grantors is also key. Don't hesitate to reach out for clarification or guidance when needed. They're more than willing to usually talk with you through what some of the requirements are, or if it's not clear either in the grant documentation or in the CFR, whether it applies to you, reach out and ask the question. And then just making sure that, you're thorough and consistent in the documentation of all your grant related activities. It really is helpful when we have to come in and do an audit at that point, or if someone else is looking at it from the government perspective and they ask for documentation, you have that already. And then finally, some consequences for non-compliance. It can definitely lead to serious consequences. One major risk is financial penalties or the need to repay funds that were improperly used. So if we come back and say you have a significant amount of unallowable costs that were reimbursed with grant funds, often the government may say you need to pay that funding back. And so organizations may lose current funding or become ineligible for future grants, which can significantly impact overall programs or your mission that you're trying to accomplish at the end of the day. Beyond financial effects, non-compliance can damage, the organization's reputation. It makes it harder to build trust with donors and partners. It can lead to increased scrutiny from auditors and regulatory agencies, resulting in more frequent or intense reviews. And then in severe cases, non-compliance may result in legal action against the organization or its leadership. So next, I'll hand it over to Halie to discuss how policies and procedures can help set you up for success and making sure that you are meeting some of these compliance requirements and meeting the requirements of the grant. Halie, if you want to get going.
Hello, I apologize. My browser kicked me out as soon as I tried to unmute. I hope everyone can hear me now. So I'm going to walk through the keys to success in setting up your grant compliance policies and procedures. We're going to start off with a polling question. I'll pass it over to Danielle.
Thank you, Halie. Here is poll question number 2. What is the state of your organization's grant compliance policies and procedures? A, our policies and procedures are current and comprehensive. B, we have policies and procedures, but they likely need to be updated, improved. C, we have policies and procedures, but they are old and have a lot of gaps. D, what are grant compliance policies and procedures? As a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. Again, please click the button next to the answer you choose and make sure to hit that submit button. And here are the results.
Okay, so looking at this, it looks like about 75% have some sort of policies and procedures in place. They might be a little outdated, but at least a lot of organizations seem to have those in place. That gives me an idea of kind of where a lot of you are starting from, but I'm going to go over kind of the basics of how to develop solid P&Ps or policies and procedures. So the most important thing is this first step to identify the policy scope and figure out what you have out there. So taking a full inventory. We're going to dive into that in just a moment, a bit more. Going through the process, so once you know what you have, how current it is, where you have gaps, the next step is to prioritize a policy development plan. So establishing, hey, we need policies in these various areas, which ones are the highest risk and highest priorities, and which ones can maybe be developed later in the year. Next is to create those comprehensive documented policies and procedures. So a lot of times when an external auditor or a funder comes in, the first thing they're going to ask you for are show us your policies and procedures over grant management, grant compliance, and those aspects that are impacted by grants, which is a lot of parts of an organization that some people might think of and which we'll talk about later. So making sure that you have documented current policies and procedures in all of these key areas. And then once developed, training, implementing, and monitoring. So I've worked with a lot of organizations that historically they will have good documented policies. However, their people don't know that they exist, or they are not using them, or they're not reflective of the current organizational structures, systems, and processes. So one of the most important things is to train personnel on those policies, implement them, and then monitor and update on a regular basis for any change. We're going to dive into some of these steps now. So identifying the policy scope. So when we think of grant management or grant compliance policies and procedures, it's larger than just the grant management function. So of course it covers, how we identify grant opportunities, how we set up new grants, how we monitor compliance, but it also is impacted by a lot of finance and accounting functions. So when we think of procurement, payroll for time and effort reporting, fixed asset management, record keeping, a lot of those things across the organization that are finance and accounting related. Next is program management. So what are we doing with the funds and how are we actually carrying out our programs? How are we verifying eligibility? How are we documenting our performance? And then others that we'll talk about on a future slide. So one of the most important steps is to perform what we call a policy and procedure inventory. So collecting and identifying what are all the policy documents that are out there, process workflows, guidelines that people are following that might be in memo or other format. Inventorying all of those, understanding what the current coverage is of those, when they were last updated, and understanding if they're really in place. Then performing a gap analysis, saying this is where we need to get to for grant compliance, and this is where we are right now. So where do we have complete gaps, maybe missing documented procurement policy, or where do we have policies that need to be updated? Maybe we have a comprehensive record keeping policy, but it hasn't been updated in 10 years. So evaluating that coverage. And then, as I mentioned, develop that prioritized policy plan that really focuses on the high risk areas. For any of you that have documented policies in the past or have that responsibility within your organization, it is a very time-consuming process if you do it right. So making sure that you have a prioritized plan and that you're setting realistic expectations for getting your policies to a good place. So I'm going to go over the scope of what your policies and procedures should cover if you receive significant amounts of grant funds. Really, all organizations should have these, no matter what level, if this is their first grant that they've received or if they receive millions of dollars a year from various granting sources. So on the grant management side, it's everything from beginning to end of the grant life cycle. So how does your organization identify potential grant opportunities? How do they apply for funding? What are the approval and review processes for going after new funding? Next is the pre-award process. So what do we do when we get a notice of award? Who has to review draft prime agreements prior to executing them? who's responsible for assessing the compliance requirements on the front end before we enter into a binding agreement for a grant. Next is post-award. So establishing really within the organization, how are the grants going to be monitored? So what systems are we going to use from an accounting, timekeeping, and grant management perspective? What are people's roles? A lot of people will think that grant compliance is a finance function or maybe just a grant team's function if you have that. However, it does impact almost all individuals across an organization. So defining roles and responsibilities accordingly. What is our award timeline and what are those requirements? And if we are going to be doing re-granting to subrecipients, how do we do that? Next is making sure that we're documenting how grant reporting is done. Again, a lot of times people think this is just a finance function, but it impacts anyone that's involved in that grant function or carrying out of a program. So establishing what are our requirements, what are the related due dates, how are we going to monitor alerts and timelines to make sure we submit all required reports by the timeline, and how are we going to make sure that reporting is accurate and that we're maintaining all required documentation for audit purposes. And next is making sure that our grant management policies address all applicable requirements that are in your prime funding agreement all the way, and if it is federal funding or it even refers to the federal standards, making sure that your policies are addressing all requirements, which we'll talk about next. So when we think of grant compliance, having documented policies and procedures in all of these areas is highly important. So establishing those roles and responsibilities for compliance. What are the program or the department employees responsible for that are receiving the grant funding? What's our finance and accounting team's responsibility? What is grant compliance's responsibility if you have that? But clearly defining that to be able to monitor accountability. Documenting a comprehensive compliance monitoring program, which we'll talk about next. Establishing meaningful timelines for how we're going to monitor grant compliance throughout our organization and on what timeline that's going to be done. Establishing in your policies how you're going to monitor and report on grant compliance, which we'll talk about more, and also documenting what training is going to be required across the organization for all of those that are impacted by grant funding that's being received. And then, as I mentioned, there are other areas that many federal requirements as well as specific funding sources require that you have documented policies and procedures in place. So a big one is procurement. Auditors, one of the first things they ask for is, let me see your procurement policy. And one, they're going to make sure that it's in compliance with the CFR, if that's applicable. But two, they're also going to make sure if you say this is how we do procurement, this is the number of bids we get, here's the approvals that we have to have based on dollar thresholds, they're going to audit against those documented policies to make sure that your costs are allowable and that you're following the procurement requirements. Next is going to be record retention. Grants do require that you have a comprehensive record retention policy for grant-related documentation. That includes the reporting you're submitting to funders, payroll-related items, expenditures, and how we're going to monitor for compliance, as well as programmatic. So things of eligibility or participant file documentation. How long are we going to keep those things for, and making sure they meet the standards of either your prime agreement or the CFR. Next is conflict of interest. A lot of organizations have some sort of COI processes in place, but a lot of them do not have documented COI policies. So how are employees going to report potential conflicts? How's it going to be monitored, and how do we address it? Next is subrecipient monitoring, which Dani is going to cover later in this presentation. And then next is financial management and accounting. Ensure that all your significant finance functions, how we budget, how we do financial reporting, how we enter into an agreement for an audit, how we manage our assets, all of these things impact grant compliance. So making sure that we have good comprehensive policies in place. And last here is time and effort reporting. You really needs to be documented. How are we going to monitor employee time or their effort that they're putting into each of our grant awards or funding sources? So keys to success and successful policy implementation. I do a lot of work with organizations in this area, and these are some of the things that I have seen are vital to making it successful. Ensuring you have the right stakeholders on the front end. So making sure that when we are drafting policies, we have all the right people having a seat at the table, so that once we have a final grant management or procurement policy, we have the support from all of the relevant stakeholders. Getting that buy-off and support from leadership, really that tone at the top that policies are important, compliance is going to be monitored, everybody needs to play their part. Training employees on what their role is. Policies mean nothing if they are put on a shelf or stored in a file and employees don't understand how they're supposed to carry them out. Monitor for compliance, which we're going to talk about, and evaluate the results and make adjustments. If a certain policy or process is not working, making sure that you're revisiting those documents regularly to see if updates are needed. All right, now we're going to talk about establishing an effective internal grant compliance monitoring program. A lot of organizations seem to take grant compliance kind of as they go. So we got a new grant agreement, we're going to carry out the reporting, and we're going to make sure that all costs are allowable. Versus having a defined monitoring program internally to make sure that monitoring is a normal part of the process. We're regularly checking in on, are we compliant? Are there areas that we can improve? Are we identifying potential compliance concerns early, rather than waiting until the end and we get in a position where we have an external audit or a funder audit come in and we're surprised by negative results. So some of the benefits are setting expectations across the organization of accountability, people knowing that there is going to be internal monitoring and reporting on whether or not we're meeting our compliance requirements or not, sets that tone. It allows for the early identification of potential compliance risks. So the worst thing is to have a funder come in and do an audit and you're not prepared. But if we know on the front end that we maybe have a lack of documentation for certain expenditures, or we were late on a funder report, if we're monitoring for that, we can help mitigate the risk by putting in corrective actions before that funder audit happens. It also allows for those corrective action plans to be established, saying, you know, we know that we missed this one report, for example, it was 2 weeks late. However, we've implemented these processes to make sure that we're on time going forward. And it also identifies training and resource needs. Employees want to do the right thing. They want to continue to have the organization get grant funding. So making sure that we're identifying where there's potentially some knowledge or expertise gaps, and providing our employees with the resources to be successful in grant compliance. So the steps to establish an internal monitoring program, the first thing is to identify all of the requirements. So when I do this for an organization, I come in and say, let's look at a comprehensive list of all of your funding sources. What is the dollar amount of those funding sources? What is the period of the award? So that we have a full list of all of the sources of potential compliance requirements. For each of those, identifying what the applicable compliance requirements are. So if it's federal funding, or if it's state or local funding that refers to the CFR, you already have those identified. But a lot of funders will include specific award requirements. Those can usually be found in your prime agreement. And also many of the large funders at the either state or local level, or even at the federal level have requirements, handbooks, guidance posted on their website that your prime agreement will refer to. And then next is assessing the risk of non-compliance. So there might be hundreds of potential compliance requirements once you make this list, but assessing the risk of which ones are going to really impact our carrying out of a program and meeting expectations, incurring allowable cost, and which ones are the most risky. Next is developing that compliance monitoring program. So documenting specifically how are we going to monitor for compliance throughout the year, and what is that timeline? So maybe an example is for all of those departments or programs that receive and expend federal or state funding, that we are monitoring small or medium-sized samples of expenditures that they've charged throughout the period, and tying it to supporting documentation, making sure we're in compliance with our policies, making sure that the costs are allowable. Define the reporting framework. One of the most important things about establishing and carrying out a successful compliance monitoring program is making sure that people know that the results are going to get visibility, the good and the bad. So with that, making sure that you have meaningful reporting mechanisms. So tracking the results of the monitoring performed. So how many times were we late on submitting funder reports? Was that concentrated to one program or department? Where have we seen improvements? So have we been testing allowable cost, and certain departments have been very successful, their documentation is in order, making sure that those are established and that the reporting that's coming out of it is one, holding employees accountable, but also pointing out the good and the improvements that you see over time. And in carrying out the approved program, making sure that you're communicating to all relevant stakeholders, from the employees that are running the program all the way through those charged with governance, understanding and communicating that this is our compliance program, it's important, here's how we're carrying it out. And regularly track any open findings or corrective action plans. One of the worst things is for an organization to identify, hey, we have some unallowable cost, or we have some findings in reporting or eligibility checks that we had done, and then not actually following through to make sure that it was resolved. So what should be monitored? We've talked about a couple of these, but really your organization should have an internal program that is monitoring on a regular basis for these specific areas, and there may be more. General expenditures we've talked about. On payroll expenditures, one of the big findings that we typically see is a lack of documentation for time and effort reporting. So if we are allocating portions of employees' time and effort, their payroll expenditures, that we have supporting documentation to say either by the hour, this is how many hours people worked and we can show that allocation, or by the percentage of effort, and that we have a process in place that is documented to make sure that our allocations for payroll expenditures are properly supported. Going along with that is cost allocation, making sure that you're monitoring. Let's say if a program is allocating 30% of a specific subcontractor's cost to their grant, making sure that there's documentation on file to show this is why we're allocating 30%. Here's the rationale, and the department or program is updating that on a regular basis. Next is cash management, making sure that if we are doing cost reimbursement requests in a timely manner after expenditures are incurred, or if our grants are based on drawdowns or forward funding, that we have the balances, the cash in the bank to cover what we've been advanced, and that we're timing it accurately and not pulling down large amounts of grants and not spending it for 6 months. Reporting, we talked about monitoring those report due dates and supporting documentation. Eligibility on the program side, do we have consistent processes in place for documenting eligibility, documenting program participant information. Period of availability, making sure that we have good processes in place to show that if we are 50% of the way through a program and we've already spent 90% of our grant award, that we have a tracking process to be able to raise a red flag that might be a problem. And subrecipient activity, Dani is going to talk about next in this program. All right, Danielle.
Thank you. Everyone, we're at poll question number 3. Which are important elements to establishing a successful internal monitoring function? A, understand your requirements and related non-compliance risks. B, get stakeholder buy-in and support. C, report on compliance results and progress. D, all of the above. You do have the option to submit questions in the Q&A window. We have quite a bit of content to cover today, so if we don't have time to respond during the webcast, we will do our best to follow up with you afterwards. We'll go ahead and leave this open for about another 10 seconds here to get a few more responses. And the results, Haley, I'll pass it back to you.
All right, well, looks like everybody was listening to the presentation. Number 1 is very important, understanding your requirements and risk of non-compliance, but the answer was all of the above. All right, and I'll wrap up with showing the keys to a successful program. We talked about these, but making sure that you're getting support on the front end from everyone across the organizations, setting that expectation. Compliance is everyone's responsibility. Reporting on both the good and the bad to call out those successes and those things we have opportunities for improvement, and making sure that you're tracking the follow-up required and identifying additional training needs so you're giving employees the resources they need to be successful. I'm going to pass it over to Dani to talk about subrecipient monitoring.
Great, thanks, Haley. Yeah, I'm going to cover subrecipient monitoring. So some of the learning objectives for this piece is just really understanding, well, what is subrecipient monitoring, how an organization can conduct their risk assessment to determine the level of monitoring needed, and then some tools to help you monitor, and when findings at your subrecipient exist, how can you come alongside them in their corrective action plan. One of the most important things about subrecipient monitoring really is that it's a continuous process. So we'll cover these key requirements in detail, but just sort of summary level, one of the important requirements of monitoring is ensuring upfront that your applicant is not suspended or debarred, and that your contract agreement with them has all the required language inside of it. You want to ensure that your subrecipient, if they're meeting the single audit threshold, is getting a single audit performed by a third-party accountant, and then taking enforcement actions when it's needed of your subrecipient. So I mentioned subrecipient monitoring up front, and it's important to do this before you go under contract, is ensuring that they're not suspended or debarred. And this can be accomplished in a couple ways. An easy way is going to sam.gov, and you can look up the information of this applicant, either by their legal name, their DUNS number, their UEI. All of that's likely available in their application to you. You throw in a search, and if they're not suspended or debarred, the screen will pop up, no records found. And a lot of organizations do this, but where they fail is they don't hold on to the documentation that was performed and when. So when you look this up via sam.gov, important to save that screenshot that says no record found to PDF, electronically sign it so it has a time stamp, who reviewed it and when, to really prove out to yourselves that it was checked before you went under contract with the subrecipient. But another option that's particularly popular is just to obtain written certification from the applicant stating that they were not suspended or debarred. Either way, highly important to hold on to that documentation in your records. As Sheila and Halie both commented on, record retention just really important as part of grant compliance is concerned. So when you look at the Code of Federal Regulations, the 200.332 lists the requirements of you as the pass-through entity. So we just covered Part A, which is making sure that subrecipient is not suspended and debarred. Then the next part, B, is a really helpful checklist for you. If you go to that, it holds about 14 bullet point items of things that need to be explicitly stated in your contract agreement. So a lot of organizations have boilerplate templates that you add on to. So just ensuring that these items are listed in your contract agreement with your subrecipient. There's a few things, make sure you're compliant, but it's their way of knowing how they can be compliant with that grant and award, down to the things of what is the assistance listing number on this program? What is the period of performance? Is this research and development grant? Yes or no? Is there an indirect cost rate? What is that rate? All of these things should be spelled out a lot of times in the first 1 or 2 pages of the agreement so that there's no question to what is expected. Really the core, once you've gone under contract with the subrecipient, is performing on your end a risk assessment of the subrecipient. So things that you should consider, and when I say consider, also document your consideration, are things like, what is the subrecipient's prior experience with this grant? Have you worked with them before? Have they had this grant with other organizations? What are the results of previous audits? Have there been findings? Have there been clean audits? If there have been findings, were they corrected in the next year? Are there new personnel working in the program, or some substantial change in any systems they're using? Newer personnel or a change in system would lead you to need to intensify or increase frequency of your monitoring, because those things lead to higher risk. And then if there's been any federal agency monitoring, what did that look like? What were the results of that? So all of these things can change the dial of how often you're doing monitoring of your subrecipients. You need to do it at least every year so that you have something on the books, although that's a small number. So you might, from your risk assessment, determine we need to do desk reviews every month because there's a new program manager in the seat. And then maybe 6 months down the road, you dial back to quarterly based on results. So risk assessment and documenting that, just really a highly important aspect of monitoring. Ultimately, you're on the hook for the results of your subrecipient. So just think about everything that Halie just went through as far as what you're responsible for your grants. Now imagine the subrecipient is also responsible, but now you hold the responsibility of their performance of those items. So it's a serious item, so you really want to know your subrecipient and where their strengths and weaknesses are. So items that you need to monitor from them are reviewing their financial and performance reports. Your contract agreement would spell out when those are due to you. If you're noticing late submissions, means that you probably need to do some heavier monitoring of them until they get back on pace with you. And if there's findings in any sort of federal monitoring or external audit, ensuring that they take corrective action plan and you're seeing the remediation of the issues, and then helping them to resolve audit findings quickly. Corrective action, if they do have an audit and they have findings, part of the audit submission to the clearinghouse is a corrective action plan. So if you're seeing a corrective action plan, you should go in and help monitor the status of what is their plan, how is it getting corrected, is it effective, really know the cause and effect of the issue so you can help ensure that it's not a repeat finding and it's not bleeding into any other contracts that they might have. Some monitoring tools, a lot of times site visits are very effective, going in and talking to the personnel that are responsible for the grant, viewing files with your own eyes and documenting which ones you're sampling to look at. A lot of times this might not be feasible because maybe your subrecipient's not even in the same state as you, so desk reviews are really helpful, which would be putting on the books a frequency that you've both agreed upon. Maybe it's quarterly and you set it on your calendar when it's going to be performed, and you determine, I'm going to look at 10% of the eligibility files or 10% of the submitted invoices for reimbursement and look at the underlying detail to ensure that they're collecting and retaining all the required information. An important aspect of that monitoring, the site visits or desk reviews, is to document everything that you did on your end. If you are getting information, so if you're doing a desk review and they're submitting eligibility files to you, for example, holding on to that support to prove what has been done. If there are no issues, you don't want to pull the same people on the next cycle. You really want to rotate through. And then, if you assign a grant personnel on your end to perform the monitoring, and it's on a quarterly basis on their calendar, having their supervisor on the same notification so they can get in and review and discuss the results. All of that is a helpful tool to ensure that it's not missed, and if vacations happen, you can move it around. And then reviewing detailed submissions of reimbursement requests when they submit to you what they are going to be reimbursed for, ensuring that it is in line with the budget for that grant. It's highly important to ensure that they're not going over on any aspect. Sort of some common pitfalls that we see a lot, and this was discussed earlier too. If your policies and procedures are a bit weak, maybe your policies and procedures don't call out subrecipient monitoring because you don't have any subcontracts. So, that might be a higher risk area if you don't have any, but if you're going to start subcontracting out, you should bolster up those policies and procedures around that. So have a written policy of what does your risk assessment look like, what does your monitoring look like, who is doing it, who's reviewing it, and what changes do you make based on the results of your subrecipient. Holding on to documentation is certainly a really important item to do. for your end, and then in some scenarios, your subrecipient might need to come to you if you've collected something that, for whatever reason, they've lost it. I'm going to move to Danielle for our last poll.
Thank you, Dani. Here is our final poll for our webcast today. How often must your organization monitor each subrecipient? A, only once problems are identified. B, at the end of the contract agreement. C, at least once a year. D, at each reimbursement request submission. For those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them now from the console. We will also be sending them out via email tomorrow, along with a recording of this webcast. And we'll go ahead and leave this open just a little while longer to get a few more responses. All right, I'm going to go ahead and forward us over to the results.
All right, looking at the results. So a little bit tricky. C and D, at least once a year, are at each reimbursement request. So depending on what level of monitoring you're considering, so the true monitoring where you're documenting your risk assessment of your subrecipient should be happening at least once a year, and those desk reviews and site visits, et cetera. But certainly every time they're submitting a reimbursement request, you want to be doing your level of reviewing to make sure that's against the budget. So maybe a little bit of a trick question, but for the holistic, what is subrecipient monitoring when you're thinking about their audit results and their change in personnel, all of those things at least once a year. And then my closing item before I pass it back to Danielle, in everything you do, document and retain. More and more organizations are looking for the documentation inquiry, and we saved it, or email is a great tool, but that shouldn't be relied upon as your storage of documentation. So really bolster up if it's weak how you're documenting everything you do, and you should have great success. I'm going to move it to Danielle to help close us out.
Thank you, and thank you so much to our presenters for a great presentation today. To our audience, if you have any further questions or comments, please reach out to us, as we would be happy to continue the conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window or reach out to the presenters directly. Their contact information is in your console, as well as in the slide deck, which you can download now from the handouts window. If you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks as well. Finally, here's a link to a survey for today's presentation. Your feedback is always appreciated. Again, thank you for joining us, and take care, everyone.